Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming on such a gorgeous spring day when you could be sunbathing or whatever.
Living it up.
I'm David Blight. I teach in the history department here and direct the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. This is a special thrill. You don't get a chance very often to introduce one of your heroes. That's going to embarrass him. We met something like 25 years ago. He won't remember this, probably, but it was at a conference in Milan, Italy, of all places. I only got invited because Ira Berlin had to pull out because his son was graduating from high school or something, and the theme was memory. And somebody said, that guy Blight, he's writing on memory, invite him. And that's how I first met Eric. Anyway, about 3 or 4 years ago at what I think was a Frederick Douglass Book Prize dinner, Eric took me aside and said something about a special document he had uncovered or was working on at the Columbia Library about the Underground Railroad. He kind of asked me if I knew anything about it. I didn't know anything about it. And then he said something like, don't tell anybody about it. I said, I don't know what you're telling me about. How can I tell them about something that you haven't told me about? And anyway, that's part of the kernel of this new book. But let me introduce Eric properly, at least in some brief way. It's not easy. I had the great privilege to write an afterword invited by his students when they did a Festschrift back in, 2007, 2008, whenever that was. And it was a chance to try to assess, I'm not going to read it to you, don't worry. It was a chance to assess in some ways Eric's impact on this profession. But one of the ways you can find it, if you look, is in his book of essays called Who Owns History? And in that little book of essays, Who Owns History, there's a little autobiographical piece. Historians don't often write anything autobiographical. He wrote a short piece called My Life as a Historian. And in it, he makes this wonderful case about what he called, I quote him, the interconnectedness of past, present, and future. And then there's also a passage in that little essay where he talks about his book, Reconstruction, the great synthesis of Reconstruction. And he says, quote, ultimately, the book's merits derive from the fact that I care deeply about the issues of racial justice central to Reconstruction and to our society. If Reconstruction was born in the archives, it was written from the heart. Eric's one of those historians who has always been deep in the archives, and this book is from deep in the archives. In fact, in some old-fashioned ways that I kind of love. But he's also almost always written from the heart. This comes in part by family roots, as some of you surely know. It comes by training. It comes by a set of assumptions about why we do history. And I'll tell you one other quick story. At that Milan conference, or one of those Milan conferences, it was at the very end of it, and there had to be some big ending paper, and I think it was by Leon Litwack. And somehow out of the discussion, you may not remember this either, but out of the discussion, we had got into this was about 1990, 91. We had got into this discussion of whether there was a revival of black nationalism going on within scholarship, in society. And I remember Eric getting up. I swear you said this, so if you don't remember it,
I have no recollection.
If you don't remember it, just
No.
Let me tell the story. He got up at the end and he said something like, this is all well and good, but we can't change the world if we don't write this together. Change the world? And I was this young nobody sitting there listening to Eric Foner. He actually believes history can change the world. He actually believes that. Of course, a lot of us still want to believe that, and we try to write as though it might matter. He's kind of always written as though that matters. Very quickly, I'm not going to go through all the books, but I do want to mention a few things. Eric's written books on everything from Tom Paine, as some of you may remember. That wasn't even his first book. He wrote a seminal work on the origins of the Republican Party, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, a book from 70 that all of us who've ever studied the coming of the Civil War still read. He did that wonderful little book of essays called Nothing But Freedom, which I think was the Fleming Lectures at LSU, which is still a place to go to understand the labor problem during Reconstruction. I still steal quotes from it in my Reconstruction lectures. Then came the great, there are other things in between, but the great synthesis, 1987, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, a period of American history about which it is not easy to synthesize. But he did it, and it still sort of sits there as the synthesis we all use or that we all refer to. Out of that, he spun Freedom's Lawmakers, that directory or that collection of Black Reconstruction politicians. There's no other text quite like that. And then for a broad readership, but a scholarly book for a broad readership, which has been Eric's trademark, he wrote the book called The Story of Freedom, Story of American Freedom. That idea, that most ubiquitous of words in our language. And he traced its history right through time, all the way to whatever the present was. An amazing kind of achievement about a single idea in time. Who Owns History, the collection of essays that were really about public history. It was at a moment when a lot of us were trying to become public historians, and Eric was one of those people leading the way. In fact, the two people who dragged me at first kicking and screaming into public history were Eric Foner and my dear old friend Jim Horton. And then he wrote a textbook, a single-authored textbook that damn near blew away all the other textbooks on the market, including the one I'm an author on. Give Me Liberty, the single-authored textbook for the college level. And you don't want to know what the rankings are. Well, maybe you would want to know what the rankings are of textbooks these days. Book of essays on Lincoln called Our Lincoln, which he did out of a conference that he hosted at Columbia just before the Lincoln bicentennial. It was probably in '08, I guess. And one special, wonderful little claim from that book, as Eric may remember, the book it was a book of essays, about 10 or 12 people wrote essays about it, and it got one really brutal, savage review. I won't name any names, nor even the journal it was published in. But that reviewer was especially, he didn't like Eric Foner, to say the least, and he didn't like the whole book, but he singled out my essay, which was and he linked Eric.
That's why we put you in there as sort of a defense mechanism.
It was one of my few claims to fame. We were singled out as, quote, left-wing holy rollers. I mean, what do you have to do to, I don't know. It's crazy. And that, of course, was leading to the fiery trial, his book on Lincoln and slavery, which won the Pulitzer. He's won the Bancroft Prize, the Pulitzer Prize, the Lincoln Prize, and about every other prize. He's been the president of every association we have, well, almost every. The AHA, the OAH, the Society of American Historians. He's been Pitt Professor at Cambridge, Harmsworth Professor at Oxford, all in one lifetime, which is hard to believe. And now, because he didn't have anything else to do, he resurrects the Underground Railroad from the archive in this book called Gateway to Freedom, The Hidden History of the Underground Railroad. So when this book came out, I thought, rather than just have Eric come up here and give another lecture about a book, that maybe we'd try to have a little conversation about it where I can ask him not only about this book, but maybe about Reconstruction or whatever else comes up, and you get to ask him whatever you want to come up as well. Eric, the Underground Railroad has always had, at least in our lifetime, a reputation problem. Mm-hmm. So why did the Underground Railroad at this moment need rethinking, which is the title of your first chapter?
Yeah.
Why rethink that problem?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here, David, and for your very kind words. It's always a pleasure to be here at Yale. I see a lot of familiar faces, former students, friends, and others in the audience. So, I'm delighted to be here. The Underground Railroad, I think part of its reputational problem lately is the exaggerated claims that were made by previous generations, mostly, as you know, Wilbur Siebert, who really was the founder of scholarship on this long ago, around the turn of the last century, wrote several books, did a lot of interesting research, but tended to present the Underground Railroad as this kind of mighty system with thousands of agents all over the place, north and south, and took the railroad metaphor a lot too literally, with set routes and maps and stations and agents and, secret tunnels. And, the picture of the Underground Railroad that developed in the earlier part of the 20th century was just way exaggerated, since historians always like to revise everything anyway, as you know, the catalyst for this was Larry Garrah's book in the early 60s, The Liberty Line, in which Garrah took Siebert to task and said he's just propagating a myth disseminated by white abolitionists in which they were the heroes, they were the main protagonists, assisting basically helpless slaves. And in fact, Garrah said there was no giant organization. There were some people who helped fugitive slaves, no question about that. But it was mostly free black people or slaves in the South, but free blacks once they got to the North, free black communities, and the whole literature had sort of obscured the role of black communities. This appeared in the 60s at a time when, as you well know, the emphasis on African-American history and on the quote-unquote agency of African-Americans was really coming to the fore in scholarship in all sorts of ways, and it really struck a chord, and it led to a long period of neglect of the Underground Railroad. John Hope Franklin and Schwenniger's book about runaway slaves in the 1990s didn't even mention the Underground Railroad except once or twice in the index. In fact,
that book never really left the South.
Yeah, it was talking about people who ran away in the South and just stuck around, hung around for a while and then came back to the plantation. But in the 90s, I was an advisor on this National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, which now is there in Cincinnati. And I remember well a conversation, with the designers, and then there was a guy from Procter & Gamble, big corporation there, who was they were putting up millions and millions of dollars for this thing. And of course the historians are going on, well, we have to show the mythology of the Underground Railroad, we have to show it's all exaggerated, we have to show it didn't exist. And this is a life lesson I learned from this.
I was one of those people saying we have to.
Yeah, and the guy from Procter & Gamble finally said, look, I don't know anything about this history, but I do know this. You don't run down your own brand name. This is an Underground Railroad museum. It's not going to be about how there was no Underground Railroad, It'd be like Procter & Gamble putting out ads saying, hey, Colgate is no good for your teeth. No, they're not going to do that, and I think we should bear that as a maxim for living. Don't run down your own brand name. But more recently, I think people, a lot of local history of the Underground Railroad has been done in the last 10 years, often by people who are not academic historians. They're local people digging into local records. Sometimes it's quite exaggerated, and they're trying to attract tourism and this kind of thing. But I think we now, I didn't originate this, but there's been this kind of revival of interest in these local networks. See, my definition of the Underground Railroad, it's not some well-oiled, highly organized system. It's local groups, local networks who communicated with each other, obviously, who rose and fell over time. They were not constant. They often had gigantic problems raising money. The number of people involved was pretty small, really, but nonetheless they did, and they were black and white. It was an interracial operation, and they did assist a number, if you want to know my estimate, I'll tell you, but some number of slaves to escape from the South and reach safety in the North or Canada. So the Underground Railroad did exist. It was not this giant system, but on the other hand, we shouldn't just dismiss it as a myth altogether.
A network and a system. Remember that. Because over the years, that's what we would always debate. Was there a network? Was there a system?
Right.
This book shows, yes, there was a network. Can I take you back, and we'll do some history moving forward now. Let's say 1787. It's an interesting little moment in your book where you quote first the Northwest Ordinance, which restricts slavery in the Northwest Territory. And then, 1 month later,
No, in the Northwest Ordinance.
In the Northwest
it
Ordinance.
says
Yeah.
how slavery is banned in the territory north
Right.
of the Ohio River, but
yeah.
slaves escaping into that area from places where slavery is legal
Right.
must be returned.
Right. And then a month later,
Is the
in
Constitution.
the Constitutional Convention debates, they pass
They put it into the
Fugitive Slave
Constitution.
Clause. So you've got these two contradictions.
Well, the Constitution is a compromise,
Well,
as you're
indeed,
well aware,
indeed.
of course.
Indeed. But that sets up such
Yeah.
an immensely contradictory legal history.
It does. I'm not a legal historian.
You are in this book.
This town, yes. Well, the thing is, Yale is full of legal scholars who are ersatz historians.
Whoa!
No, they all want to be historians in the law school here. I think that's great.
Is John Witt here yet?
No, John is,
a real thing.
they're always writing history. That's good. I don't disapprove. I wish we had more people like that in our law school. They just write about contracts and stuff. But,
I was writing novels, too.
yeah, so the legal history is very complicated. You know, the Constitution on this is somewhat vague. It says, of course, it doesn't use the word slave, as you all know. It says persons held to labor, escaping their jurisdiction, must be returned. But it doesn't say who is supposed to return them. It doesn't say how they're supposed to return. Is it a federal obligation? Is it a state obligation? What procedures are supposed to be used? 1793, they passed the first fugitive slave law to implement this constitutional provision. But that's also, basically what that one says is, hey, if an owner can go up and grab a fugitive slave, he can take him back. It puts the onus on the owner to go and get his fugitive slave. Well, that wasn't so easy to do in many cases, you know? As time went on, northern states began to pass laws, not to prevent this, but to create legal procedures. If someone comes into your state and grabs somebody, you want to have a procedure to determine, is that the fugitive slave? Is he a free man? Is this really the owner? So they set up these procedures, but then Southerners become more and more alarmed because these procedures are actually interfering with the rendition of fugitive slaves. I'm not going to go. The legal history, I did become an amateur legal historian on this because it's like the common law of recaption. I never heard of that until this.
Recaption? I thought that was a misprint when I first read it.
Recaption.
That's
no,
a word.
That is real. The common law of recaption, which is the right to basically property that is mobile can be retrieved. If your horse escapes,
Recaption.
runs away, your horse runs away, goes out of the and goes onto someone else's land. You can go and get your horse. You don't have to go to the sheriff. You don't have to go to court. You just get your horse and bring it back, right? Well, that's fugitive slave, same thing. You can go and get your fugitive and bring him back, as long as you don't create a breach of the peace. In other words, if your horse gets onto someone's land, you can't punch the guy in the nose and then take your horse back. And since resistance develops in the North, recaption becomes harder and harder. But that is the common law right. By the way, it applies, a man could go after his wife runs away. He can go and grab her and bring her back. But the wife can't run after the husband. Under the common law, it's
No
unequal.
economic rights. Okay, this is largely a New York book.
Yeah.
If you don't know that already, when you read it, you'll realize it. Now, by the teens, 1820s, and this was striking to me. New York has a kidnapping problem, a huge kidnapping problem.
Yeah.
Lay that out a little bit, because this is
Well, people know about kidnapping now somewhat from the movie
12 Years
a Slave.
Yeah, that's much later.
Which is later, and actually he was in upstate New York. But in New York City, the first thing we have to remember is this, and I'm a New Yorker, very proud of it. We have a self-image in New York as a progressive-minded, multicultural city that welcomes immigrants. We've got our Statue of Liberty. We're not like the rest of the country, these crazy people passing in, you know. So that was not what New York was in the 19th century at all. New York was very closely tied to the slave South. My uncle Philip Foner wrote a book about this before I was born, although some people give me credit for it. So they do. I'm sorry.
written enough books.
I have written a lot of books, but I am unable to write a book before I'm born.
I don't know.
But anyway, business of slavery. New York merchants controlled the cotton trade. New York bankers financed the expansion of slavery. The local government was very tied into the South. In other words, New York was not a safe place for fugitive slaves at all. And there were these gangs going around kidnapping people off the streets, particularly young children. Black kids were just picked up by kidnapping gangs and taken to a ship and sold into slavery in the South. Naturally, the free black community, which was growing rapidly in the 1820s, 1830s, was very alarmed about this and began to organize to stop kidnapping.
There was a gang in 5 Points called themselves the Blackbirders.
The Blackbirders.
Yeah.
There was a
gang down in Delaware.
Yeah. There was a public official, the recorder, a judicial official, Riker, who actually was specialized in, under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, the owner could just take a slave to somebody, to an official, and just get a certificate to remove him. Well, these kidnappers would bring a black person to Riker and say, hey, this is a fugitive slave.
And he would grease that immediately?
He would just give them a certificate. Okay, then take them back to the South. And so he worked hand in glove with these kidnappers.
Then you lay out the case. It's a very chronological book. You lay out the case then for what you call...
I believe in chronology. I think
that's
that's what separates us from the sociologists.
It does. There are a few other things that do, too.
Right.
Let's not go there. What was I going to ask?
Oh, sorry.
Others have used this term, but in the 20s and 30s, you say now there is a new abolitionism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's rooted in what? It's rooted in, first of all, among blacks.
It's rooted in anti-colonizationism among blacks and in evangelical revivalism among whites. Now, you and I both know that my former student and your good friend Manisha Sinha has a book coming out in a year in which she will criticize the idea that there's a new... in other words, she will show a lot more continuity.
That's what our students are always doing.
Yes. But nonetheless, yes, there is this new... And the key, of course, is that it's an interracial movement. This is a unique thing in American history before the Civil War, an interracial political movement dedicated to ending slavery and incorporating African Americans as equal members of the society. They're not that interested at the beginning in fugitive slaves. That comes a little bit later. But then they do get interested in that.
But that comes about especially, the concern for fugitive slave comes about especially late 20s and especially 1830s and 40s with something called the Vigilance Committee.
Absolutely.
And the American Anti-Slavery Society, which establishes an outpost in New York.
Right.
Explain that a bit, because that's where the real origins of what is called the Underground Railroad.
I mean, if you want to know who founded the Underground Railroad, maybe there is no such thing. David Ruggles has as good a claim as anybody. A black abolitionist in New York who was the key guy in creating what they called the Committee of Vigilance, the New York Vigilance Committee in 1835. It was a mostly black organization, but with white members of the board, the activists. It was funded by both black and white people. And it was first founded to stop kidnapping. But very quickly, it then moved on to helping fugitive slaves. It's the first organization dedicated to helping fugitive slaves. There had been fugitive slaves, ever since there had been slavery, there had been fugitive slaves. And fugitive slaves had come through New York City, but there was no organized mode of assisting them. Like J.W.C. Pennington came through New York in the late 1820s. Nobody helped him. There was no organization. Maybe some individuals helped him. Frederick Douglass arrives, 1838, and there's the Committee of Vigilance. And a black man he meets on the street says, you better go to David Ruggles' house because he'll help you, you know. So now there is an organization, and Ruggles is quite plugged in to abolitionist groups in New England, upstate New York. And these little vigilance committees get founded by the mid-1840s. There were these vigilance committees in Philadelphia, in Boston, upstate New York. They're communicating with each other, and that's kind of the infrastructure of what we might call the Underground Railroad. Now, in New York, the abolitionist movement, this annoys anybody who studies it and is sympathetic to them. They spend half their time fighting among themselves, right? Especially after 1840, when the AAS, the society splits between the Garrisonians in Boston, et cetera, and the New York group led by Louis Tappan, who, for complicated reasons, are not even worth going into. But so you got
They thought it was worth going into.
They were always going into it. That's all they do is denounce each other. Occasionally they go in.
Even when they win a victory, they try to take credit for it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So now the thing is, the Garrisonians wrote the history. And so one of the things that I came out of this study with, which surprised me, was far greater respect for Louis Tappan than I used to have. You know, Louis Tappan, a very wealthy merchant in New York, he basically is the funder for all the abolitionist activities in New York, including the
Silk Titan.
Yeah, he's a big, rich guy. But he puts his money where his mouth is. You know, now he's not as radical as Wendell Phillips and Garrison in some ways, and he seems, we don't like him, secular historians, because he represents the evangelical wing, and he's always badgering people about being more moral and all this. And he even sets up the first credit rating. Dun & Bradstreet comes out of Tappan, measuring people's morality or business. All right, anyway.
But he got radicalized when a mob burned his house down.
Yeah, they burned his house down in 1834. That wasn't too cool. But, and he moved to Brooklyn Heights as a result, which you could afford to do back then. But, you know, but he still worked. Anyway, so there were, after 1840, there's 2 national abolitionist organizations and 2 outposts of the Underground Railroad in New York. There's the Vigilance Committee, which is all Tappanites, because that's where the money comes from in New York. And then the Garrisonians set up their own outpost, which is headed by this guy, Sidney Howard Gay, where the National Anti-Slavery Standard is published, the weekly Garrisonian newspaper, published in New York, even though there are hardly any Garrisonians in New York. That newspaper, that weekly newspaper, in 1850, a time when there's 500,000 people in New York City, has 102 subscribers in New York. There are just
we quote it like it's a Bible.
We quote, yeah. No, they had a lot of subscribers outside of New York City.
Yeah, I know.
But New York City was not a hospitable place. So you get these 2 groups helping fugitive slaves, among others, and they're right around the corner from each other. If you look at my map,
I did.
they're both way downtown. They're right near where City Hall is now. One is on one street, and the other is right around the corner on another street. But they're sort of competing with each other to help fugitive slaves, which is kind of cool for these slaves.
Yeah, right. And okay, and when Ruggles and his groups would rescue somebody, there's almost like a ritual formula or pattern to it. Some stevedores maybe on the shore, right? Get the word that there's a fugitive coming off that ship, or there's a slave master in town with 2 slaves. The word gets to Ruggles. He gets up a crowd.
Right.
Suddenly, a crowd of 100 black people appear. Then you get the lawyers on it. Explain how
they have a whole system. However, what's interesting about Ruggles, and again, Douglas is typical of this. Ruggles doesn't have any real connections to the South. So he doesn't know people are coming. By the 1850s, they know people are coming through. But here it's just people who turn up. But when they do turn up, people, a lot of times they turn up at the docks, either because they stowed away on ships or because they came on a train, like Douglas. And the train did not come into Manhattan at that time. You got off in New Jersey and took a ferry. So, all these black dock workers are kind of alert, and they keep an eye out. And if a fugitive slave turns up, they get him over to Ruggles' house. They're not agents of the Underground Railroad in any organized sense, but they know what to do to help fugitive slaves. And then Ruggles knows some people who will hide them in their house for a few days. He himself does that. And yes, they go to court. But going to court is not easy. They go to court and they generally lose, because the law is pretty clear. If someone can identify this guy as a fugitive slave, he's going back. The other thing, though, that they do fight very successfully, especially after 1841, is getting freedom for slaves brought into New York voluntarily by
what's
their
called the freedom principle, which means
the freedom principle. The freedom.
Explain that a bit. Because in some ways, this is, we always are talking about the long civil rights movement.
Right.
And it gets longer and longer, although I don't know where that debate is at this point. But that activity, this mixture of direct action and legalism is all over.
It is, and it's very important. I had a letter. This is private. I'm going to turn. No, I had a letter, an email from a friend of mine who, in the 1970s, was involved in certain activities, and which I will not go into. But he said, when I read your book, I realized for the first time you can be both underground and overground at the same time. And I said to myself, man, I wish you would realize that in the 1970s. You would have caused a lot of people would have been saved a lot of trouble. But put that aside, yes, they operated secretly and illegally, and at the same time they operated totally above board and legally, going to court, getting writs of habeas corpus. The freedom principle. A fugitive slave must be returned, but what about a slave who is voluntarily brought? Now, you go back to the Somerset case, right? The air of England is too pure. Where slavery, in other words, is a creature of local law. If a person moves out of the jurisdiction where that local law applies, they revert to their natural status as a free person. Now, unless the law says something else. Now, in New York, they abolished slavery over a long period of time, down to 1827. It finally ends. But even at that point, the right of transit still existed. You could bring a slave into New York City or New York State for up to 9 months.
Right.
In other words, there were still slaves on the streets of New York City after slavery was abolished, legally. Many, many Southerners came up to New York for business and other purposes. They'd bring slaves. The hotels would get them a room. Free blacks could not get a room in a hotel in New York City. But slaves coming with Southern masters would get a room in the hotel. Maybe not a suite, but a room. But when William Seward was governor in 1840, they passed a law abolishing the right of transit. Henceforth, any black person who enters the state, except a fugitive, is free. But Southern owners still kept bringing slaves into the state. They didn't want to be bothered with this. And so the Vigilance Committee they get them free. They go to court, they get court orders saying this person is free. And hotel waiters or hotel cooks, waiters, people like that would go up to black people who were brought into the state and say, you know, you can be free. If you wish to be free, you can be free now. And if they said, I want to be free, they would go get Ruggles. Or after now Ruggles leaves New York in 1840, so the Vigilance Committee goes on with others, Theodore Wright, and the whole...
Another big breakup among the others.
There's another big breakup. The Vigilance Committee fights among itself, as usual, and Ruggles is thrown out. It's, they're all crazy. But, no, I admire them a lot, but I wish they had devoted themselves to fighting slavery more. But anyway, but the Vigilance Committee lasts all the way up almost to the Civil War.
Yeah. And there are lawyers now who repeatedly...
Not a lot of them. There's about 3 of them.
3, okay.
There are 3 lawyers.
John Jay Jr.?
The most important was John Jay II, because he's a graduate of Columbia.
Oh, okay.
So we're very proud of him. Well, we're not actually. There is no mention of John Jay II anywhere. A little parenthesis, I was telling David, I'm running a seminar this term, just as was done here and other places, studying Columbia's history with slavery. John Jay II is the only abolitionist that I can identify who went to Columbia. We didn't produce a lot of abolitionists, but he was a real abolitionist. And
Yale had 4 or 5, didn't they?
Yeah, right. And by the way, just like you, we gave an honorary degree to John C. Calhoun once. Nobody knows that at Columbia.
We gave a college.
Anyway, yeah, John Jay went to court and got people free all the time who were under this lack of, the end of the right of transit. And he tried to get fugitive slaves off, which he often couldn't do because the law was against him. But yeah, he did this. He was blackballed by one of the leading clubs in New York because he was defending fugitive slaves. They wouldn't let him become a member, even though he was from a very, upper crust kind of family.
Now, before we leave this Vigilance Committee and the way it functioned and operated, I want to just throw 2 or 3 names at you and get because there are. I mean, if you study this field, and apologies for those of you who don't, that's okay. It's all right.
You can study something.
But sometimes, we've heard of Frederick Douglass, we've heard of Harriet Jacobs, we've heard of some other famous fugitive slaves. But there's some unsung people in your book.
Absolutely.
That are new to almost all of us. Example, Louis Napoleon.
Louis Napoleon, favorite.
Tell us about
I never heard of Louis Napoleon before I started doing this research.
Me either.
Now, Louis Napoleon is not working with the Vigilance Committee. He's working with the group in the Garrisonian in Sidney Howard Gay's office. But he is a free black man, born in 1800, right after the gradual emancipation law was passed. But that meant he had to serve an apprenticeship of about 25 years before he would actually become really free, which he did in the 1820s. He's a kind of shadowy figure. We don't know when he got involved in helping fugitive slaves. But certainly by the 1840s, his official job is like porter in the office of, or janitor or whatever, in the office of the National Anti-Slavery Standard. But his real job is going around. He's the point man in the city for fugitive slaves, going to the docks, going to the railroad depot, meeting people, bringing them, helping them get up to Albany or wherever they're going to be going. Louis Napoleon is illiterate. And yet he is able to go to court and get writs of habeas corpus to demand that people who have been seized be brought to court. He's well known throughout the city, even though he has no public presence. He's never mentioned in any newspaper.
You pick him up in Gay's letters?
You pick him up in Gay's document, which we talk about, and also in the city directory you can find him. And occasionally he will be there at a black meeting. Louis Napoleon has helped organize this meeting. But there's enough little pieces of information to piece together Louis Napoleon. But the favorite thing about Louis Napoleon is that in the 1850s, in a big case, Lehrman versus, Napoleon v. Lehrman, where Napoleon goes to court and gets a writ to free the slaves of a guy named Lehrman, who had been brought to New York, because he's moving with his family to Texas, but you can't get from Virginia to Texas without going through New York and getting a ship. And when they arrive, Napoleon gets a writ of habeas corpus, like 7 slaves. You're not allowed to have slaves.
This is a woman and like 6 children.
Yeah, women and children. It becomes a major case. It's pending before the Supreme Court when the Civil War breaks out. Right. But in one of these cases, John Jay is now the lawyer for these slaves, and the lawyer for Virginia says, well, who is this Louis Napoleon who brought this case? Is he the Emperor of France? And Jay says, no, he's a much better man.
One or two others before we leave that. This guy, Jacob Gibbs.
Gibbs, another I never heard of him either. Baltimore. He comes out of Baltimore. This is a guy.
Well, a lot of fugitives come.
Yeah, Maryland had such a big, Maryland is close to the north. It's a lot easier to escape from Maryland than from Alabama, let's put it that way. And there's, as you know, half the black population of Maryland is free by 1860. So there's a lot of black people on the road. There's nothing unusual about seeing black people moving around, unlike in South Carolina, for example. So it makes it easier for fugitives to operate in Maryland. But Gibbs is a free black man in Baltimore. He's a house painter. He's got a little operation with other black people, his employees, and he goes out and paints plantation homes. They hire him. Owners say, come on and paint job. But while he's doing that, he also has a little stash of forged or counterfeit free papers, which he hands out to slaves. He says, hey, if you want to escape, here's a pass for you
You can't make this up.
Yeah, no, this is true. And then they get onto him, and he hightails it to New York eventually in the late 1840s and becomes an operative in the Underground Railroad in New York City. But you find him in these meetings and these public events. But also, Gay will say, well, I can put someone into Gibbs's house, for a couple of days. So he's another, I'd never heard of Gibbs either when I started doing this, but he's another interesting guy.
How about Albert Fountain?
Oh, God, yeah, another hero.
Sorry,
now,
these people are so cool. I didn't know
Fountain is actually mentioned a lot in William Still's The Underground Railroad. William Still, the chief operative of the Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia, later published this book, The Underground Railroad, which was a tremendous collection of all sorts of information he had gathered about fugitive slaves, published in 1872 and then new editions. But the problem with that book is he just threw everything into his kitchen sink. There's no mode of organization. Now that it's online, you can actually search it for names. But before that, it was just this.
You can reorganize it for him.
Yeah, it was this potpourri of stuff, but it's fascinating. But anyway, Fountain, according to him, and Gay, was a ship captain, one of innumerable ship captains plying the Atlantic trade. There were thousands of ships up and down, not the Atlantic coast, and many fugitives escaped on these ships. I mean, and by the way, these ship owners would charge them money. It was a little sidelight. Take some money from a slave and hide him in the hold and dump him off in Philadelphia or New York. It was illegal, of course, but there were far too many of these ships for them all to be searched. Well, Fountain did this many a time in the 1850s, and some of the people passed through New York, and he was a pretty courageous guy. And one incident that still relates, the mayor and some people arrived at his ship and said, we got to search. There were like 20 fugitives down below, and we're going to search this ship. And Fountain grabbed an axe and started. He said, there's no one on this ship, and I'll prove it to you. And he starts splintering the deck. He starts cutting up the boards on the deck, and the mayor says, take it easy, Fountain. Okay, I believe you, And so they go away,
I think this is a screenplay he wrote, actually.
Yeah, I know, it's amazing. And Fountain, and there were letters about Fountain, and one letter a guy writes to Still from Boston saying, if you see Captain Fountain, please tell him please visit Boston. He has a lot of friends up here who would love to see him. I mean, you know, it's crazy. But
And his ship was called?
the City of Richmond.
The
City of Richmond found the ship.
A couple of cases. The James Hamlet case.
Yeah, Hamlet. Well,
And there are all kinds of cases.
the first fugitive to be arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was in New York City. New York is a pivot of the Underground Railroad and of the whole irrepressible conflict. You've got a very pro-slavery administration. You've got a very activist black community, plus some white abolitionists. It's obviously midway between the networks now coming up from the South, from Maryland, Philadelphia, and then upstate New York. And Sidney Howard Gay is sitting there at the nexus of this, because he's married to a Quaker woman from an abolitionist family in Philadelphia. So he has these connections southward. But as the Garrisonian editor, he has all these connections.
He edits the National Anti-Slavery.
All right. Hamlet is arrested. He's a guy who escaped from Maryland a couple of years before. He's working in a shop. He's arrested at his shop right after the law of 1850 is passed. He's brought to a U.S. commissioner. This fugitive slave law creates this new post, U.S. commissioner. They didn't trust local judges anymore, so now federal authorities will deal with this. And he's sent back. I mean, in a day, he's gone. You know, his wife didn't even know that he'd been arrested and dispatched back to Maryland until, you know, after it was over. The case went very fast, and his wife and 2 children are living in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, actually. So Hamlet is the first guy to suffer rendition under the feud. But he's lucky because the representative of the owner says, hey, if you can raise $800, you can buy the freedom of Hamlet. So the black community has this big meeting in a church, and they raise money, and some merchants also. The way it had been done offended a lot of people, even who were not anti-slavery. And a week later, Hamlet is back as a free man in New York. And there's a giant rally of black people in City Hall Park, the first time that they'd been allowed to have a big public meeting in City Hall Park, and Hamlet is presented. And it's a giant celebration for the free black community.
There's even a lithograph done of it.
Yeah, and then they carry him to the ferry where he goes back to Williamsburg and all this. But the merchant community gets alarmed by this. They don't want the South to think that New York is not willing to enforce the fugitive slave law. So they create their own organization, the Union Safety Committee, dedicated to enforcing the fugitive slave law. So now you've got the Vigilance Committee and Gay's operation, trying to help fugitive slaves, and you've got the Union Safety Committee of the rich merchants trying to capture fugitive slaves and send them back. So New York is this real pivot. But the Hamlet case, well, Harriet Jacobs talks about it, of course, in her, fugitive slave narrative. It scares the wits out of the black community because it shows this thing can really be enforced. And, buying the freedom is not in the cards for everybody. And in the 1850s, a good number of black people flee New York City. Not just fugitives, because remember, the fugitive slave law is retroactive. You could have been there for 20 years and you still can be grabbed. But even free people who could be caught up in this system, which is totally biased in favor of the claimant. In fact, one of the first fugitives who was captured in Pennsylvania in that year is sent back by a commissioner to Maryland, and when he gets there, the owner says, hey, this is not the right, this is the wrong guy. I never saw this person in my life. But nonetheless, the whole procedure had been that he's the fugitive slave.
Say a few words, then we'll get to Sidney Howard Gay, but say a few words about just what a pivotal moment the Fugitive Slave Act was.
It's pivotal in every way. It's pivotal legally and constitutionally. If you believe, there are a few benighted people who believe the Civil War was fought over states' rights. You've met a couple of them.
I heard about it at Appomattox yesterday.
You heard about it. Yeah.
And on my emails.
So ask them.
Let's not go there.
Ask them how do you explain the Fugitive Slave Act in that case? The Fugitive Slave Act is the most vigorous exercise of federal power over the states in the whole period from the Constitution to the Civil War. It completely abrogates all sorts of local legal procedures, laws in the North. It makes it a federal crime to assist a fugitive in any way. It creates this whole new set of public officials, federal officials, whose job it is to help get fugitive slaves, and it says the Army can be used, the federal marshals. It is, as I say, the South did not believe in states' rights. They did when it defended slavery, and often it did, of course, because slavery is a creature of state law. So states' rights prevents national interference with. But when it comes to protecting slavery, they're also quite happy to use very, very vigorous federal action. So on the law also galvanizes the abolitionist committee. It leads to not only a great mobilization, but a lot of people talking about using violence for the first time. You know, the Garrisonians were pacifists and they didn't believe in violence, but now they're saying it's right. You can use violence to resist the fugitive slave law. And instead of intimidating the Underground Railroad, it actually makes it more vigorous and more active, that the resistance to the fugitive slave law becomes a major activity of abolitionists.
In the book I'm doing on Douglass, I had thought I could handle his embrace of violence, or at least possibilities of violence, you know, in a few pages. I ended up writing a 40-page chapter on that because it is so important in his life.
Yes.
From the late 40s up to the early 50s. And among other things, you quote him saying, you know, the only way to make Fugitive Slave Act dead letter is
a few dead
to create a few dead slave catchers, right?
Yeah.
Now, he never killed a slave catcher,
No.
mind you.
But some
people did.
Yeah,
Some
Christiana,
people tried.
Pennsylvania, a
Absolutely,
slave
right,
catcher
right,
was killed, an owner, and certainly there were violent rescues
Oh,
of
yeah,
fugitive slaves.
many of them. All right, talk about this guy, Sidney Howard Gay, because he kept a record of fugitives around which you build this book.
So here's what happened. Back in a few years ago, a senior history major at Columbia, Madeline Lewis, who was also working as our dog walker, so I saw her every day.
That's a footnote for you.
Yes, and she's in the acknowledgments. I give her full credit. She's a lawyer now, by the way. She doesn't like actually being referred to as a dog walker, so I only do that in small groups. But she was writing a senior thesis about the journalistic career of Sidney Howard Gay, this abolitionist editor in New York, who then he's well known in the Civil War because the managing editor of the New York Tribune, a major, major job, and he basically runs the New York Tribune, where Horace Greeley is, you know, totally eccentric and mercurial.
Imploding.
Yeah, and Gay has to keep the thing on an even keel, you know, and push for emancipation, but not go off on every enthusiasm of Greeley. But before that, he was running the Anti-Slavery Standard. And she says, you know, and by the way, we have 80 boxes of his material, his letters, in our library at Columbia. And she says, you know, in box 72, there's this thing called the Record of Fugitives. I don't know what it is. It's not really relevant to me, but you might find it interesting. So I filed this in the back of my mind, and one day I'm up there in the Rare Books Library, and I said, hey, bring me box 72 here, would you? And so it's actually 2 little notebooks. By the way, you should know this in your Gilder Limited, we have digitalized it. It's online. It's a fascinating thing for teaching, because basically Gay kept a record of over 200 fugitive slaves who passed through New York City.
Over 2 years, right?
Over 2 years, 1855, 56, men, women, children. And he's a journalist. He interviews them. Where did they come from? Why did they escape? How did they escape? Who helped them? You know, he gets their experiences, and then he records, okay, Napoleon went and met them or something and sent them to Boston or sent them to Syracuse or sent them to Canada, how much money he spent. It's this incredible record right at the moment. I mean, you get the voice of these fugitive slaves through Sidney Howard Gay, but it's not so much as reminiscence that we rely on, which of course is, you know, often has to be dealt with with a grain of salt. But this is right then. And, you know, so I saw this. I'd never seen any document like this before. Now, actually, still kept records like that also, and those are also now online at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And at least half of the people Gay deals with had been sent by William Still. So you can actually...
It's a Philadelphia, New York.
Yeah, Philadelphia, New York. You can juxtapose those accounts and then really expand what you know. So basically, I decided I'm going to do something with this document. I didn't even know what. You know, normally when you set out to write a book, you've got a problem, a question, the subject, and you try to figure, well, what sources do I need?
Supposedly.
Yeah, supposedly. You're writing about Frederick Douglass, so you got, well, what kind of material is there about Frederick Douglass? Quite a bit, I'm sure. Right. This is the opposite. Here you have a document, and you say, well, I want to do something with this. What? So I start working outward from it. You know, who are these people who are mentioned? The first thing is, let's try to verify the stories as best we can. Are these guys just making it up? Well, no. You can go to the census and find the owner. You can find a lot of them actually in fugitive slave ads in the Baltimore Sun, Washington newspapers. A few days earlier, the owner is advertising them. You can find a bunch of them in the online Canadian census of 1861. They reach Canada. They're living there in 1861. And then there are letters. Gay is also, his correspondence is talking somewhat obliquely, because it's all illegal, of course, but you can track down. The one thing you can't find is anything in his newspaper about it, because he's not going to be
mentioned.
Never mentioned. He talks about the Underground Railroad in other places.
That's the secret public relationship.
This is what's happening in Syracuse. This is what's happening. But New York City, nothing in the newspaper that he's editing. But it's a fascinating document. And as I say, it really reveals that by the 1850s, there was this network. I don't want to go, I don't even want to call it a well-oiled system, but it was a network of people in communication with each other. This is the Atlantic, or the Metropolitan Corridor. I'm not dealing with Kentucky and Ohio. There's stuff going on out there also. But between Norfolk, Virginia, Richmond, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, southern Pennsylvania, where there are a lot of Quakers, rural people who are helping fugitives.
And all the people on his over 200 are Maryland, Delaware, Virginia.
That's about it.
That's it.
They're not coming from the deep south. There's one guy from South Carolina. No, they're all from the upper south, and that's not surprising, because that's a lot closer.
And the longest passage is about?
Harriet Tubman. Yes, he has a long, long passage about Harriet Tubman coming through twice.
Which is a great deal of what we actually know about.
Yeah, she comes through, he interviews her, and what's interesting is he calls her Captain Harriet Tubman. I asked some friends of ours who have written about Harriet Tubman, did anyone call her Captain Harriet Tubman? No. This suggests at least he knew who she was, right?
It's called General.
Well, yeah, John Brown promoted her to General and called her General Harriet Tubman. But that's an 18...
John Brown is here today, so
all right,
we'll
good.
have to ask him.
John Brown called her that like in 1858 or 59, I think. Yeah. This is 1855 or 56. Right. So Harriet Tubman pops up, and but by the way, there is another guy. This is what David pointed out before. These anonymous people, or people unknown to history, who pop up. Frank Wanzer. He's a minor league Harriet Tubman. She went back like 7 times. He comes through with his wife, and they get out, and then 6 months later, he's back. Because he's gone back to bring some other people out. He's from Virginia, Western Virginia.
There were more than Harriet Tubman going
So there were more
the
people
South
than Harriet Tubman, and then twice then he passes through Philadelphia and then New York City, and then he gets out again. I mean, that's pretty dangerous, needless to say,
Before we wrap up, say a few words about the way you end the book. You make a case for how this complex history of fugitive slaves, this complex history of resistance to their capture is, you call it a crucial cause of disunion and war.
Well, yeah, and I think it is. This is one of the key elements of the sectional conflict.
And it's all over the secession ordinances.
The longest complaint against the North in South Carolina's declaration of the cause of secession is not about Lincoln's election. It's not about the westward expansion of slavery. It's about the difficulty of getting back our fugitive slaves. And they use that as a kind of symbol of northern hostility to the South. Whereas in the North, the Fugitive Slave Act, I think, does really exacerbate anti-Southern sentiment. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that most people in the North are abolitionists. We all know that's not the case. Probably Lincoln was typical. Lincoln never helped a fugitive slave in his life. I'm sorry to say. Never. Why? Lincoln was a believer in the rule of law, the Constitution. Lincoln said in that famous 1855, in that letter to Speed, I hate to see the poor creatures hunted down, but I bite my lip and keep silent. Why did he keep silent? Because this is the law. Lincoln believes in the rule of law, Probably most Northerners believed in the rule of law, but there were a lot who found this intolerable.
And some major politicians who...
Yeah. Well, of course, it was Seward,
Chase.
in his great speech on the Compromise of 1850, who used the phrase, the higher law. There is a higher law. In condemning the fugitive slave law, there is a higher law than the Constitution, the law of morality, the law of religion. Well, that was completely unacceptable to the South, right? If you're going to go by the higher law and not the written law and the constitutional law, how are their rights going to be? So yes, there were, and to go back to our business of Southern and states' rights, Wisconsin tried to nullify the fugitive slave law. The Wisconsin Supreme Court declared the fugitive slave law unconstitutional, which then the U.S. Supreme Court reversed,
So Southerners weren't wrong in
No.
claiming that a lot of Northerners were never going to return their fugitive slaves.
Right. On the other hand, there were hundreds of fugitives who were returned
Right.
in the 1850s. This law was enforced in many places. We should not think that every every fugitive who got to the North was safe. They weren't. That's why they had to get to Canada after 1850.
And those numbers are startling.
Yeah.
Possibly as many as 20,000.
We don't
really know.
Nobody knows, but Gay actually, in his History of the United States, he wrote later on, said 30,000 I think that's not a bad number, 1,000 a year in the 30 years before the Civil War.
Moving to Canada.
Becoming free, having escaped from the South. A few of them still, land up in upstate New York or something, but after 1850, they got to get to Canada. And, there were 4 million slaves. This is not destroying the system of slavery, fugitive slave, but it is a catalyst, as you said, of the sectional conflict.
Well, I'm going to save my questions on Reconstruction. I feel like we should open this up to this smart audience, just teeming with questions. So let's open it up. Steve Alderman, go first.
I just wonder about the numbers involved. As far as the number of people involved, you said 30,000.
That's the number of, perhaps, the number of people who got out of slavery, yeah.
Doctors, what are people involved in the Underground Railroad?
Yeah, Siebert, in his book, The Underground Railroad, gave a list of over 3,000, quote-unquote, agents of the Underground
Called
Railroad.
them saints at one point.
Yeah, I think this was a bit exaggerated. In New York City, there were at no moment were there more than a dozen people devoting a lot of time to helping fugitive slaves. Often, I quote this letter, well-oiled machine, I quote this letter that Gay writes to William Still in 1856, in which he says, look, Still, because by this time, Still is sending people and he's telegraphing ahead. 2 guys are coming on this train, blah, blah. So what's his name writes back and says, look, we really have almost no one here to meet them. You're sending people who arrive at 3 a.m., there's only Napoleon and me in this office. Napoleon can't go out at 3 a.m. and meet people. This is ridiculous, so you got to send him during the day. But, so there's Gay and Napoleon, and then there's Gibbs, he says, maybe. But this is not a giant system, right? Now, there were a few others around. There's one or two here or there. But it's, I think in each city, again, the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, 7 or 8 guys, it's not a big system, but there are enough of them who, the key is the people on the street who know what to do. Because most fugitives have no idea. It's not like they know they're going to New York and they're going to run into Sidney Howard Gay, but people know, send them to this place, send them to that place.
Was there any correspondence with Underground Railroad? I'm just going to review this more in the West.
The West is a whole other story, which someone else needs to write about. No, this was up and down the Atlantic coast. They had nothing to do with Kentucky, the West. But one thing that's important to note, though, apart from the fugitive issue being a problem in sectional relations, it was also a big problem in international relations. The federal government, pretty much under the control of slave owners, was constantly at odds with the British about their refusal to send back fugitive slaves from Canada or from the British Caribbean, if a few got there. The Mexicans gave refuge to fugitive slaves from Texas, wouldn't send them back. That became a major diplomatic problem. Native American tribes sometimes gave them shelter. So the federal government was spending a lot of time badgering foreign countries to give back fugitive slaves, which they often didn't want to do.
When Douglass arrives in New York, if you've read his narrative, although he said almost nothing about the escape in the narrative, he says it later. But,
later on.
he arrived not knowing anybody.
No, he has no idea what he's going to do.
And some guy in the street he decides to trust who says, get to Lispenard Street, find David Ruggles.
Yeah.
And within 24 hours, he was at Lispenard Street.
The first guy he meets is another fugitive slave,
Right.
Jake.
Yeah, Jake. Allender's Jake.
Allender's Jake, who tells him to get out of town because there are slave catchers all over
Go
the place.
back, he tells him.
And then Jake, of course, becomes a case. Jake is then arrested a year later and actually sent back to the South, I think. And it becomes a big case in New York City. So,
By the way, an example of Eric's attention to detail. When he was writing this, he emails me and he says, can I read your chapter on Douglas's escape? He reads it and he says, are you sure he arrived at Chambers Street? You sure it was at the foot of Chambers Street? I said,
now, I'll tell you what he said. He said,
I said that's what the city says. There's
I know
a plaque
you said.
there.
You said, well, there's a monument there. Right. So that is not a sufficient primary.
Shouldn't have brought that up.
Right,
Never mind.
sorry.
Strike that.
No, but by the way,
But you use Chambers Street.
I do use Chambers Street because we have no idea where he arrived. So there is a monument. So if
It's in Foner's book. That's where you're at.
we now declare that he arrived at Chambers
There's a
Street.
big plaque there now.
You can't prove he arrived somewhere else.
No. Anyway. Yes, right here, around the corner. Please.
Do you want people to use these mics when they give?
It's probably a good idea.
Probably good. Then everyone can hear you better. There's a microphone standing
Why
right
don't you
there to
pass the
ask
mic
questions
there,
from.
David?
Also, the video camera will probably pick it up
Yeah.
better.
Eric, what was it or is it about the Quakers that made them so active in the whole underground movement?
Right. I believe this young lady told me before that she's descended from Quaker abolitionists, so I commend you for that. However, I must say, the Quakers were not all that abolitionist by this time. Now, it is true, in the colonial era, the Quakers were the first to really raise the question of slavery in a moral way, and I give them great credit for that. And it is certainly true that where your ancestors lived in southeastern Pennsylvania, Chester County, there were a lot of rural Quaker families who helped fugitive slaves and gave them shelter, and men and women. Grace Anna Lewis, and now she's fairly well known among scientists. After the Civil War, she apparently became one of the major female scientists in America, but before the war, she was part of this Quaker family who was helping fugitive slaves, and she and her friends had this little sewing circle because to provide clothing for fugitives so that they didn't look like slaves when they're sending them further on. However, the fact is that by this point, there were big countervailing pressures against Quakers getting involved in the abolitionist movement. Quakers, didn't like to work with non-Quakers. They were very insular. By the way, they weren't that great with blacks either. They didn't let a lot of blacks into their meetings, and when they did, they put them in the back and they made them sit there. A lot of blacks complained about how they were treated in these Quaker meetings. And third of all, in New York,
Maybe sorry you asked.
the Quaker meeting expelled these abolitionists. Hopper, because they were causing trouble. The Quakers like peace and quiet, and the abolitionists were causing a lot of trouble and dissent, and they basically said, be quiet about this. Now, so my quote about the Quakers in this period, the 1840s, comes Lydia Maria Child, who preceded Gay as editor of the National. She said, basically, the heart has gone out of the Quakers, basically, she said. But when a Quaker does have a soul, what big souls they have. So when a Quaker was an abolitionist, they were really...
Like Thomas Garrett of Delaware?
Garrett in Wilmington helped thousands of fugitives come through there.
Wilmington, Delaware was a major...
Which is 10 miles from, the border. But Garrett helped a lot of people, and in fact, Harriet Tubman used to come through Garrett's place. Abigail Hopper Gibbons, the daughter of a major abolitionist, and then who married another one, they lived in New York. And when she moved to New York, no, it wasn't her. It was Gay's wife. It was Elizabeth Gay. One of those two. Gay's wife was also one of those two. I can't remember which one. There was they had been in an interracial female auxiliary abolitionist movement organization in Philadelphia. When she got, whichever one it was, I can't remember, it doesn't matter. They're both Quaker women. When they got to New York, she discovered the female anti-slavery organization would only allow whites in. and she would not join, so she joined a black women's so there's this black women's abolitionist group consisting of all black women and this one white Quaker woman, because she would not join the other one. So when they were abolitionists, they were pretty principled, let's put it that way. But a lot of them weren't.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here.
Henry Ward Beecher was a major figure in the 1840s and 50s. Do you feel he had any, how would you gauge, if any, his impact and the impact of the Pilgrim Church?
Henry Ward Beecher's church, the Plymouth Church, was a place where some fugitives were hidden from time to time. Beecher raised money to help fugitive slaves. Beecher gave a long speech in 1850 calling for resistance to the fugitive slave law. He was known to these people. He also had some rather odd characteristics, and I'm not even talking about his practicing Christian love a little too extensively with the wife of Theodore Tilton after the Civil War. He used to have these mock slave auctions.
You got that in there, though, didn't you?
Yeah, well, that's what I know about Henry Ward
I
Beecher,
know.
the Beecher-Tilton scandal. But
Didn't go out well.
he used to have these mock slave auctions in Plymouth Church, where he would actually raise money to purchase the freedom of slaves. But there was something vaguely pornographic about the whole thing.
They would auction off little girls.
They would put little girls up there to auction them off in a kind of symbolic sort of way. Anyway, some abolitionists didn't like this very much, that's all. But nonetheless, Beecher was certainly plugged in to the Underground Railroad in New York City, yes.
I worked in historic preservation in Vermont years ago and stumbled on occasion on houses where they'd say, this place was on the Underground Railroad.
Right.
How much do you make of those kinds of stories, and what happens to the fugitives once they get to Canada?
Well, first of all, in New York City, almost every house that was, or place that was connected with the Underground Railroad no longer exists, because in New York we tear everything down and build it. Now, Lispenard Street, Ruggles' house is still there.
It's still the same building.
Going way, way back to the
It's a
1830s.
coffee shop now.
Yeah, and then Tappan's house and the Gibbons house. There are a few, but now, yes, look, historians are professional killjoys. So, you know, all I will say is there are a lot more houses that claim to be Underground Railroad sites. I'm always getting, you do too, you know, I always get, there's a tunnel. There's said to be a tunnel under this house. I think it must have been no, they didn't have tunnels, the Underground Railroad. I'm sorry. I never heard anyone talk about a tunnel. And so, yes, there were houses where people were hidden, absolutely. But the provenance of some of these things is open to question.
I have a list of favorites, but I'll spare you.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. But in terms of what happened to blacks when they got to Canada, there were black communities up there.
All over the place.
Some of them set up by religious groups, some, you know, and they lived and worked, and they had farms, and they worked in Toronto, and, you know, they settled communities in Ontario, particularly.
A footnote. If you ever have a chance, go to Buxton, Ontario.
Buxton, sure.
Buxton is almost unbelievable. It's a town, very small town, surrounded by farming land and farms, farmed almost entirely by black Canadians. All of them are descendants of American fugitive slaves.
Many of them are, but there were also free blacks who just moved to Canada because they had better opportunity there.
Absolutely, but they hold a reunion every year on Labor Day, which is practiced the same day in Canada. And they gather up to 5,000 people who all claim to be descendants of these people. I don't know if they all are or not. And they hold a gigantic softball tournament among the families. They hold like a half-day conference about serious history and then 3 days of softball. But I could hardly believe it. You haven't lived till you've done a hayride, you know, with the Prince family, who will then take you to their cemetery and show you, you know, 5 generations back to fugitive slaves.
Sounds good.
It's amazing. It really is amazing. Yes, Tatiana.
Well, I can project, but thank you for the microphone. Professor, just a little genealogy. I took Professor Shenton's CC class, and then he told me to take your Civil War class.
Oh, great.
And so it's that genealogy that made me a historian of slavery, as well as being here, of course. I wanted to bring it back to political action in a kind of hemispheric way. when I was in your Civil War class, you encouraged us to support the union at Columbia that was striking for a better contract. And I see that the repeating pattern in your work, right, how it is that people at the bottom can support freedom initiatives. And I wondered if you could just kind of comment on that on a more present-day basis. What can we do to, for example, support people who are working for immigration reform or anything that has to do with bettering the situation of people at the bottom?
What is to be done? Someone once wrote about that, right?
Jeff,
You know, it's, first of all, we are all citizens here, right? And we have an obligation to try to make this a better society and to take part in whatever activities we think will head in that direction. I don't think the study of history tells us precisely what we ought to do. It doesn't give us a blueprint for the future. I think, you know, you're right. I mean, much of my work is about people who have tried to improve this society. That's all, you know, whether it's abolitionists or Reconstruction activists or labor people or whatever. Those are the people I'm interested in. I'm interested in social change and how it takes place. But, you know, I don't think it's the role of the professor to give people political instructions or, you know, this movement or that movement. There are certainly plenty of areas in our society that are in dire need of improvement. And whether it's immigration reform or mass incarceration or economic inequality or many other things, I commend people who work on try to become activists in those areas. But I feel uncomfortable trying to suggest to people what they ought to do. Now, when it's on your own campus, like the effort you referred to of graduate students to form a union, which I gather happened here once also.
still exists.
Or maybe more than once. Then I think you should step up and say, look, these are members of our community. They have a right to, you know, collective bargaining if that's what they want. So I had no hesitation there. But I'm not telling students, well, go out and vote for X, Y, or Z or anything like that. You know, I think there is a line there, but I think if you can, as a teacher, if you can inculcate a respect for the people who are activists for social change, that may inspire some students to try to do good things.
But you do believe in the historian's role in engaging the public, whether that's
absolutely.
museum exhibitions, films, historic sites, National Park Service, and
Yeah, but it's not engaging. I'm not running for office.
No. It's doing what we do for the public.
Oh, of course. I believe. Now,
Outside of these
at Columbia,
Gilder
we have
halls.
maybe because we're in New York City, we have a long tradition of people who have done this. Going back to Alan Nevins, go back to Charles Beard. Nevins, Commager, Hofstadter, you name them. They're all people who made a very big point of writing for a broader public, as you do, of course, as I try to do. And, in fact, as you know, we get annoyed a little when people who ought to know better write articles saying, why don't historians write anymore for a public? You know who I'm talking about. That's not true. A lot of people are writing.
Nicholas Kristof, about a year ago, said there were no historians engaging the public.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. By the same token, we do not denigrate monographic scholarship. There's nothing wrong with writing for
dissertations,
professional works. That's the building blocks of historical knowledge. We shouldn't be apologizing. Oh, this is just a monographic study. No, that's what we do. But we should also try to bring our knowledge of history to a broader public if we can.
Yes, sir.
The expression you gave about Lincoln obeying the law. On the other side of the coin, I mean, how much of the federal government energy was going into this? I mean, was it like a Homeland Security kind of thing, or?
Well, the federal government didn't do a heck of a lot of things before the Civil War. So it mostly. I'm sorry.
Delivered the mail.
Yeah. Energy was going in particular moments. There were very famous cases like the Burns case in Massachusetts, or There's some others. There was some in New York City where very active federal troops were used to bring one poor fellow, Anthony Burns, back from Boston to Georgia, I think it was. And there was many other renditions like that by federal marshals. Every time, I think about 12 or 13 slaves, fugitive slaves, were sent back to the South from New York City in the 1850s. That doesn't sound like a heck of a lot, 12 or 13, but as I said, it spread panic in the black community. But in every one of those cases, they had to use federal marshals. You couldn't just have one policeman take him to the train station. There were always black crowds trying to stop it. Now, in New York, they never did stop it. In some places, they had rescues. They had one in Boston, Jerry Rescue up in Syracuse. No fugitive slave was violently prevented from being taken back to the South in New York City, but partly because the city police were very happy to join in and take them back, but federal marshals. So there were what percentage of federal activity was going into this, I have no idea, but it was very visible and very, public when it did happen.
Thank you.
Back here on the aisle. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your research. I have an ancestor, a family by the name of Noadiah and Caroline Moore, who supposedly had a house in Champlain, New York, and
in where, New York?
Champlain, at the border of.
Yeah, okay.
Is there any way that I can verify? There's a plaque.
Yeah. There are a lot of these. There are a lot of local histories. There's a guy named Tom Calarco, Calarco. He's not a professor, but what the heck? He's done a lot of. He's published books about the Underground Railroad in upstate New York. So I would look up Calarco and see what he says about it, because he talks a lot about individual people up there who were helping fugitive slaves, and just see if they're in that book.
Thank you.
He emailed me and wanted to be on this panel with you, by the way.
All right.
It's another story.
Right.
Yes, back in the center there. Is that Sarah? Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering how you see this story of the Underground Railroad contributing to our knowledge of abolitionism more broadly in the period. Is it a story of forgotten and unknown people and connections that aren't in the record of stevedores? How does it contribute to the story?
I think the thing about the Underground Railroad, it is part of the abolitionist movement. These people were also going to abolitionist meetings, editing abolitionist newspapers, giving speeches. It was one kind of branch of the abolitionist movement, you might say. Now, as I say, most abolitionists were not that involved in it. There were some who were very involved. But it's part of what I like to use a term, a phrase that Charles Sumner used called what he referred to the anti-slavery enterprise. That's not exactly an organization. It's a kind of an amorphous set of actions of all kinds, the anti-slavery enterprise. It included political action, moral action, sometimes illegal action, petitions, speeches, all sorts of things. And the Underground Railroad is part of that story. I don't want to exaggerate it and say it's the abolitionist movement. It isn't. And indeed, there were some abolitionists who said too much effort is being devoted here, that helping fugitive slaves does not help abolish slavery. That the job of the abolitionist movement is to abolish slavery, not to help individuals get out of slavery, because that does not undermine the system itself. So there was some dispute about that. But, as I say, I think it needs to be seen as just a part of a very broad and rather remarkably broad set of activities of all kinds that people engaged in to try to, attack the institution of slavery.
It had enormous impact on individuals who might have even participated
absolutely.
in either rescuing or in some way aiding even a single slave. I've become tremendously impressed with the impact that fugitive slaves had, for example, on Douglas's family.
Yeah.
His sons, his daughter. He claimed at least 100 fugitives went through their house. These kids grew up seeing
Douglas's house
slaves.
was a stop, so to speak.
They grew up with fugitive slaves in the house frequently. And it had an impact, to say the least. Yes?
I just had a question. What do you think the impacts were of the Dred Scott decision on the Underground Railroad, if there were any effects?
Wait, the impact of?
Dred Scott.
Oh, Dred Scott. Well, Dred Scott doesn't have to do with fugitive slaves. Dred Scott was a man was brought by his owner. I mean, in a sense, Dred Scott's about this freedom principle. Dred Scott claimed his freedom on the basis of being brought voluntarily by the owner into free territory, Wisconsin territory, state of Illinois, places where slavery was prohibited. Did that make him free? That's the issue. And of course, the Supreme Court says, no, you're still a slave, Dred Scott, sorry. That is related to this Lehrman case, because there were people who feared that when the Lehrman case got up to the Supreme Court, they would say, people can bring slaves into the North. I mean, that was the issue in the Lehrman case. Could an owner bring a slave into the North? And it never got to the Supreme Court because the war broke out. But Lincoln and others said, we're afraid of a second Dred Scott decision here.
It would be even worse.
In effect, legalizing slavery throughout the North. You know, there's an interesting statement I quote from in the 1830s by Judge, whatever his first name, Nelson was, who was a New York State judge and later got on the Supreme Court and was one of the majority in Dred Scott. In the 1830s, in one of these cases, he says, because of the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, slavery may be said to still exist in a state that has abolished it. You can abolish slavery, but you can't get rid of your obligation to enforce the laws of slavery of other states. So slavery still exists in New York in a way. The fugitive slave carries the law of slavery with him into New York State. Samuel Nelson, that's what it was.
You can't kill it.
So, and that's what, to some extent, the Lehrman case will be about. But Dred Scott doesn't directly bear on this issue. Yeah.
Right here in the third row, and then Shane.
Thank you. Thank you for coming here. I really enjoy your work. So much of it involves or relies on bringing black voices to the fore in areas of scholarship in which they haven't been. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on the ongoing reluctance of audiences to trust black voices when they speak about oppression. And I'm thinking specifically of the Economist's review of Edward Baptist's book, in which they in which they complained that that he was not being objective in his inclusion of
that is a very interesting point, and certainly we know in terms of current situations that a lot of white people are reluctant to take at face value what black people say about encounters with the police or things like that. You know, I always tell my students, you know the Leon Litwack's great book, Been in the Storm So Long, you know, and let's go back. I mean, Du Bois in Black Reconstruction said in his great final chapter, people have failed to listen to the black voice. You know, all these historians have completely ignored the testimony of the fugitive, of the former slave, and that's why their history is no good. Fast forward 40 years to Litwack's very important book, Been in the Storm So Long. I give that to students to read, but I say, I want you to read the footnotes too. And why? Why are there so many footnotes here? Is he just showing off? What is this? You know, no. He is showing you that the black voice exists, that you cannot just say, no, that record is not out there. You know, that's the excuse. No, we can't tell what the voice of the slave is because it doesn't exist. The voice of the black person in Reconstruction, no, it's just not in the record. Litwack is badgering you with documents, you know, to say, no, there is the voice, folks. If you look for it, you'll find it. And so it's impossible after that to say, well, we can't find the opinions or the aspirations or whatever of African Americans. So, yeah, even in the historical profession, it took a long, long battle to get the African American voice taken seriously as a part of the historical record. I think among American historians today that's no longer the case, really. But in the larger society, I think that's a very interesting point. You're right.
I was at Appomattox over the weekend, and as you might or might not know, and they had thousands of people there. Black folk almost never go to Civil War sites.
Yeah.
On Sunday, they did a very special event. I'm sorry, Saturday, they did a very special event with black choirs from all over Appomattox County. They had a black preacher. They did a mock funeral of a slave woman who was killed on April 9th, 1865. It was an amazing event. There were hundreds and hundreds of black people there. The next day, which was Sunday and the anniversary of the surrender, there weren't any black people at all. I mean, it was like The Voice had a category. And now it's not the fault of the National Park Service in that case, because they really have tried hard. But
although they still won't set up a site on Reconstruction.
I know. Well, that's what I was going to ask you.
The National Park
Maybe
Service.
Shane's going to ask you. I want to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Shane White, who flew in from Australia just for this.
Thanks. Eric, I'd like to bring you back to the impact of all this on New York City, if I can. One of the things I really liked about the book was the way actually you synthesized an awful lot of writings in those early chapters and actually made more sense than the individual writers often had on the way through. To me, looking at Ruggles in the 1830s, that sort of makes sense to me, because to my mind, if you read the New York newspapers in the 1820s, the 1830s, the first half of the 1840s, African Americans are everywhere. There's this incredible cultural convulsion of freedom. If you go to the 1850s, it's gone. It's very difficult to find African Americans in the newspapers. The newspapers are bigger, longer, bigger in size, smaller stories, less emphasis on blacks. You mentioned in part the population going down, so that blacks in the 1850s are becoming a very, very small minority.
Yeah.
By 1860, there are more New Yorkers born in Prussia than there are blacks living in the city. And I find it difficult to juxtapose the activism you're talking about, which is a small group, with my sense of what's happening in New York in the 1850s.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, if people are not aware, Shane White's work on slavery and the end of slavery and the black community in New York City in the late 18th and early 19th century is, tremendously important for all of us, and I relied on it a great deal in writing this book and setting the stage, so to speak. I think it's a very good point. New York is being flooded by immigrants starting in the 1830s, but really in the 1840s and 50s, from Germany, from Ireland particularly, of course, and the black community is being overwhelmed by this. And in fact, it is devastating because the few jobs that are available to African Americans are now being taken over by white immigrants, dock workers. That had been a major, but by the 1850s, it's Irishmen working on the docks. Domestic workers in homes. They were all Irish girls, teenage girls in the 1850s, whereas previously, a generation earlier, a lot of them had been young black women. People leave not only because of the Fugitive Slave Act, but because there's nothing left for them in New York City in terms of economic opportunity. So it is a crisis period. But of course, as you well know, one of the problems with the historical record, we talked about The Voice, is New York was the place where the first black newspaper is created in the United States, Freedom's Journal. Then you have the Colored American. Then you have Ruggles' little magazine. And then it stops. From 1841, there is no black newspaper in New York City. And that is a big problem for getting into the black community because, as you say, the mainstream papers like the Tribune, the Times, don't have a lot of coverage of what is going on. They're tiny little things. Actually, you've learned more from The Liberator in Boston about what's going on among blacks in New York City than you do from New York newspapers. And then Frederick Douglass, when he has his newspapers, gives some reports on this. But the material is hard to find, and I think, but you can see this two ways. You can say, on the one hand, the black community is just being overwhelmed at this point. But on the other hand, they're still out there in the streets. They're still taking to the streets when there are these fugitive slave cases. They're having their big rallies. They're petitioning, trying to get the right to vote back, basically. So it's a story of both activism and marginalization at the same time, which is complicated. That's a good point.
And a bad exclamation point in 1860 when they hold a statewide referendum on the right to vote for blacks. Lincoln wins in New York, but the referendum on the
Referendum
black vote
loses.
goes
Lincoln,
big
though,
time.
as you know, never carried New York City.
That's right.
Either
He wins
election.
upstate.
He got about a third of the vote in New York City. He won the state because of his upstate majorities. New York was a very inhospitable place for anti-slavery.
Let's take one more over here.
You describe your historical subjects as being engaged in humanitarian sort of moral cause and also sort of vanguard political action. And I'm curious how much in the latter aspect they saw themselves acting on a strategic pivot point that you see in retrospect. Did they have a sense that they were actually aggravating the sectional crisis and bringing about some kind of confrontation, or was that a kind of happy, or
I think the abolitionists, many abolitionists, did see themselves as attempting to create a crisis. I mean, I think that's what they thought the role of a political agitator was, to bring the country to a crisis. By the way, Lincoln himself said that in the House Divided speech. A crisis must be reached. In the 1850s, there was this growing sense of crisis and of violence. Not just fugitive slaves, bleeding Kansas, John Brown. There was, rescues. So, I mean, they're not trying to create a civil war of the kind that happened. Nobody had any conception of such a, cataclysmic event. And some Garrisonians are trying to break up the Union. They want to create a crisis so the North will leave the South, and sever itself from connection with slavery. But there are people, William Still in Philadelphia, among other things, is writing articles for a Canadian black newspaper, the Provincial Freeman, in which he's explaining to the black refugees up there what's going on in the U.S. He writes a really interesting long article explaining what the Dred Scott decision is all about. But in one that I quote, in 1854, he says, a civil war may be upon us before we realize it. In other words, there is this kind of sense of a growing chasm, which no one quite knows, of course, what's going to happen. But the abolitionists wanted to generate crisis, absolutely, polarize people. Wendell Phillips thought this through very carefully. You've got to polarize public opinion to force people to confront this issue, even if a lot of them say, forget it, we're not going on your way. So they were very self-conscious, radical agitators of that kind.
In 1859, Phillips said the country needs an insurrection of thought.
An insurrection of thought, that's a good one, I like that.
Sure, what that would lead to. Douglas wanted war. I mean, there's no question about it. He didn't know what that war would be.
Right.
He had no
Although
clue
Douglas
what it would
also,
be.
I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Douglas also was kind of despairing. The great flaw of any work of history is hindsight, in the sense that we know what happened. Of course, that gives us great insight, but it also, we know Lincoln's election leads to the Civil War, leads to the end of slavery. Douglas didn't know that. Douglas is thinking about maybe emigration in 1860. He thinks the abolition movement has failed. 30 years of agitation. Slavery's stronger than ever. Maybe he's ready to go to Haiti and look at conditions there when the war breaks out. So
his daughter actually wanted to.
Does, yeah. He doesn't know what's going to happen. Of course, nobody knows what's going to happen. But we sometimes forget that about historical figures.
So in some quick way, will we at all commemorate Reconstruction? How should we? Can I invite you back next year at this very time? We'll have the panel of all panels on the anniversary of the 14th Amendment.
Absolutely.
Let's see if anybody cares. What do you think?
Well, I think the 14th Amendment could not be ratified today.
No.
Definitely not.
No.
Reconstruction.
Unless another 11 states seceded from the Union.
Yeah, right.
But it might take about 20.
Yeah. We should commemorate Reconstruction. We won't. David Blight once wrote in an excellent article somewhere, the American public likes a tragedy with a happy ending.
That was William Dean Howells.
Or you stole it from William Dean Howells. Okay. Well, that's research.
But I quoted him.
All right. Reconstruction doesn't have a happy ending.
No.
The Civil War was a terrible tragedy, but it seems to have had a happy ending in people's way of thinking about it. The Union is preserved, slavery is destroyed. Reconstruction doesn't have that kind of ending. And I think And in a way, it's too relevant to the moment. You start talking about Reconstruction.
It's about now.
You're going to get the same polarization.
But that's why we're going to do the panel.
I'll be there. I'll be there.
All right.
Tell me what day. I'll be here. I love to come.
We're going to book it tonight.
All right.
Remember now, 14th Amendment, a year from now.
Don't forget the Civil Rights Act of 1866, though.
Fine, we'll do
Critical.
both. We'll
That,
do
by the way,
both.
that couldn't be passed today.
No.
Absolutely not.
Even though it only dealt with.
It's a very important
public.
law, and it's often misunderstood, even by law professors, I'm sorry to say.
See, I knew we'd get to Reconstruction.
Not to mention
Stick
the
around.
Supreme Court, which has misinterpreted it all the way through.
I have this idea that it won't happen, but we ought to start little 14th Amendment clubs, all over the country. And everybody should be given.
There are repeal 14th Amendment clubs.
I know, but
That's
and
not
they're
what
run
we're
by
talking
the
about.
Federalists.
Let me tell you one thing about the
Society.
Civil Rights Act, which is at the very end of my book. I didn't even realize
Right.
this until I read this book. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, one of the most important laws in all our history, is modeled on the fugitive slave law. Lyman Trumbull, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, said, I am taking the mechanism that was used to protect slavery and turning it into a weapon in favor of freedom. A constitutional right, that it's a way of protecting, using the power of the federal government to protect a constitutional right. The constitutional right of owners to get their slaves back. Now it's the constitutional right of black people to freedom. This is before the 14th Amendment. The Civil Rights Act is about what freedom is. And it lays out what rights black people are supposed to have. And no official can interfere with it. No judicial procedure can interfere with it. No custom, the wonderful word in the future. Forget about the state action in the 14th Amendment. No custom, that's private action, can deprive black people of the basic rights of freedom. Federal government overriding the states. And he said, we're taking the weapons put in our hand by slavery and using them in the, in the interest of freedom. So it's an amazing thing, the Civil Rights Act, and that's the weird afterlife of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
Irony makes the world go round. We're going to have to make heroes out of Lyman Trumbull and John Bingham, who wrote Section 1 of the 14th Amendment.
The trouble is, like
It's
many
a hell of a
heroes,
burden.
Trumbull went in the wrong way eventually.
I know, yeah, eventually.
Later on, we have to
all
forget
those
about him.
Republicans did. Let's end on irony there. How about that? Let's thank Eric.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Thank you.